Well, hello again, brothers and sisters. It's good to be with you again, although it's not being with you the way that I know I want to be, and I'm sure it's not you being with me and us being together the way that we would want to be. Um, I think all of us are feeling all different kinds of frustrations and disappointments and all myriad kinds of things going on. Each one of us have different circumstances and different situations and challenges that the present circumstance finds us all in. Um, I am at the point now where I really am missing being with you. Um, it's just something that I've preached on this before. I've talked. I did a couple lessons not too long ago about God's wisdom and having us meet and come together. And one of the things I've talked about this theme, that there is no substitute for someone's real presence in our life, whether that is referring to God or whether it's referring to someone else. And I am grateful for these opportunities to do sermons like this. There are other churches that do, if you will, a live feed of things that they do. But there is never, and I want to emphasize to you, all of us, there will never, ever be a substitute for the meeting and gathering together with one another as God's people. There will never be a substitute for that, although our culture may be more and more drifting in that direction, I think. So that's just not a matter of trying to be a old fuddy-duddy. It's just a matter of fundamental truth. So anyway, I'm happy for the opportunity to be with you again, and we will just soldier on, as they say, and do the best that we can. And so I want to begin by sharing with you an interesting thing that I've read uh, today, and I saw confirmed in a couple of other things that I've read. I suppose you may infer or assume at least that I subscribe to different journals, theological journals, and uh, most of them through the internet now. I keep in contact with news and events and a lot of things that are going on within Christianity as a whole, and of course follow authors and thinkers and trends, and those are just things that I'm interested in. I think are important for me uh, in my position as a preacher to keep myself informed about. And needless to say, the subject of the COVID-19 virus and what it's doing to our culture and our society, and most of them, the articles I've been reading, are dealing with how we as the church deal with this and respond to it. And a lot of it has been, the age-old questions: is God doing something with the COVID-19 virus? Is God punishing us? Is God judging us? Um, how should we live our lives from day to day? And how can we keep good relationship with God? Excuse me for I'm having some little itches here on my face. Um, I've seen a lot of those questions, but I've come across some interesting articles that talk about different periods in human history and talk about how Christians have addressed, for lack of a better word, plagues and pandemics. So, for example, I've seen a few things about the Spanish flu in 1918 and how churches in the United States of America dealt with it. And I've come across some articles that have talked about. I have here in my outline here the Black Death in Europe. This took place in the 14th century in Europe. The bubonic plague, the Black Death. Estimates are that about 1 in 3 people in the entire continent of Europe died. It is horrific to even contemplate that 33% of all the population of Europe died. Um, and without getting into the horrific details about the Black Death and all that happened to it, I've come to learn that during that period of time before the Black Death, of course, Europe was under the influence of what is commonly called Christendom. That is, all government and society and everything was profoundly diffused with the influence of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when the Black Death took place and the overturning of all of European civilization, um, there was this observation I've seen made a couple of times now that one of the great good things, if you will, one of the positive transformations that resulted in Europe after the Black Death was what one author I read today spoke of as the return to the term that he used was interiority. That the Black Death brought in this era of the return to interiority. Now, what the author meant by interiority is that what happened as a result of the Black Death is that people as a whole, of course, Europe was already a continent under the influence of the gospel, but it brought a profound renewed sense for several generations following of people deciding that their lives had to have a much more inward focus. And that does not mean self-centered focus. It meant inner spiritual, higher realities and truths that we needed now to focus on and keep our attention on. And the gist of this return to interiority was predicated upon the fact that during the Black Death, the whole world around you was falling apart. And literally, of course, people are dying, but your civilization, your economy, everything, of course, is just completely fraying apart at the edges. And there is nothing that you can hold on to find some semblance of hope and security, because 1 out of 3 people in your family are going to die, and it may be you. Everywhere you look, there's nothing that you can count on and hold to. And so it caused a great many people to realize that we need to understand that we have been too invested in the temporal condition of our life, and we have not been invested enough in, let's call it for our sake of discussion, the eternal things of our existence. And I've seen this theme repeated a couple of times now in some of the articles that I have read on the Black Death in Europe. And you can see a lot of this in religious movements and literature, how there was this marked return to people reprioritizing their lives and getting a renewed sense that we need to live our lives for that which is eternal. So that provoked me to this observation I have here on point number 2. And that observation is this, that one of our most basic problems as sinful human beings is this, that we are almost completely focused. I'm going to put that highlight there. We are almost completely focused on the temporary, on the fleeting, on the ever-changing realities of this present age, and we are correspondingly neglecting and ignoring and losing sight of what is eternal and what endures forever. Now, I've identified this as a basic problem of sinful human beings. This is a fundamental problem of sinful human beings as a whole. I believe it's one of the most basic dynamics that explains so much about what's wrong with us, and also explains the wisdom of God and what God is seeking to achieve and wanting us to come to terms with and to realize. And that is that we are now so preoccupied and so focused upon what is now, what is present, what I have to think of today, what I have to think of tomorrow, what I have to take care of now, and then also focused on this present moment that I'm in and the things that I live with and the things that I'm surrounded by, and letting these things become the basically the sole arena of my existence. Okay? So what happens is that we are ever so quickly and so easily distracted and pulled down to the immediate cares, concerns, interests, desires, anxieties, the whole panoply of what's going on here and now, and what I got to face on, what I got to deal with, and what I got to take care of, what I have to control, and what I want, and what I'm going to do. That causes us to become blind. That causes us not to see and not to apprehend what is eternal, what is unchanging, what is fixed and will never be altered or changed, and the only reality that we can build our lives upon. So that's the fundamental thing. I mean, when all of life is summed up, it's simply this: it's God or something else. There's no other in between. Your life has only one of two choices. Your choice in life can be God, or it can be something other than God, because there isn't anything, a nice little mediating point between the two. It's either God or it's anything else other than God. Our lives become consumed with things other than God. We're under the bane of death. We're under the fear of death, and our lives are overwrought with all those fears and all those anxieties that we just talked about a couple weeks ago. And all of it is blinding us and robbing us from seeing and appreciating the eternal. And the idea about the wisdom that came to Europe after the Black Death was it was precisely in this very tragic and horrific episode in their history that actually was the thing that would cause them to wake up. Because when all of your life has been so invested in this reality now, and all of that is showing itself to be so fragile and so fleeting and so unpredictable, and something that could be so quickly taken away from me, then it causes you to say, what is there that I can build my life on? What is there? Is there anything out there that will not go away? Is there anything out there that won't grow old and become corrupted and stolen or lost or changed or altered so that what it once was no longer is? Is there anything, again, that I can build my life on? And I'd like us to invite us to think about that and to see that this is a pervasive theme throughout the Bible. So I just want to give you a couple of passages to reflect upon. So let's begin in the book of Ecclesiastes. And this is the pretty well-known statement about the time for everything. And I want you to notice this, and then I'll run us to read a few verses after it that I think helps to put what is said in the opening verses in light, in a proper context. So, King Solomon says, there is a time for everything. There is a season for every activity under heaven. There is a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. Now, what Solomon has done here is just given a very compelling, poetically beautiful description of life in the world in its present state. And he's making it very clear that life is filled, let's just call them, with ups and downs. That life is an ever-changing, ever-moving stage that we live on. That just as surely as there are times of great laughter and dancing, there are times of great mourning and great weeping. Nothing has a permanence and a stability about itself in the world in its present state. There is nothing that fits into that category. So this is Solomon's grand description of the fleetingness of life, which fills the book of Ecclesiastes, and his talking about the warp and the woof and the yin and the yang and the ups and the downs of human history and human existence. But in the midst of this description of utter, complete instability that describes our lives, he continues on, and listen to what he says. He says, "What does the worker gain from his toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on men. He has made everything beautiful in its time, and he has also set eternity in the hearts of men. And yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end." Notice the contrast here. Up in these verses up here, 1 through 8, constant, changing, fleeting, nothing that you can build your life upon is how the world is described by Solomon. And yet Solomon says there's something interior. Remember, the inner dimension, the unseen dimension of our being and our life. He has set eternity in our hearts. So in the world around me and everything that I experience and interact with is a fleeting, temporary, passing reality. And yet, there is something that God has placed within every human heart. And that is, let's just call it, for lack of a better word, an innate sense, an innate awareness, if we're willing to cultivate it and not suppress it and distort it and cover it up, of eternity. You can't get any more stark contrast than everything being completely unpredictable and always changing, and something that is settled and eternal and immovable. And God has set that in our heart. So that eternity that's yearning inside of us, from whence real life is found, is being suffocated and drowned out by the constant focus on here and on now. There's another text. It's in the Gospel of Luke. Let me get my outline up here. So that's in Luke 8 and verse 14. And here Jesus is, Jesus is interpreting the parable of the sower. And here he's talking about the seed that fell among the thorns. And here's what he says here. The seed that fell among the thorns stands for those who hear, but as they go on their way, they are choked. Choked. Now, to choke the seed means to do that which prevents life from taking place. Choking is a slow way to eventually kill. So to be choked here means that God is offering us life. He has set eternity in our hearts. And yet we're being choked. The ability for us to receive what God is able to give is being choked out by what? Life's worries, riches, and pleasures. Those three things. Life's worries, riches, pleasures. What do all those things have to do with? They have to do with here and now. They have to do with the so much attention drawn down to here that we're incapable of seeing above. And this is part of what is a measure of wisdom and understanding that a pandemic, and that's part of what goes back here to my outline here, that I make this observation that pandemics and disasters and wars, social upheavals become occasions for us. They become occasions for us. Doesn't mean it's going to force you. to see it, but they can become occasions for us to see that we cannot build our lives on this world's uncertainty, but only on the eternal God. Okay? So, um, I'm not going to get into, at least at this point, the loaded and misunderstood. The question is filled with a lot of misunderstanding in the very asking of it, which is this from God? Is God punishing us? Is God trying to tell us something by this? Listen, God can seek to teach and tell us in almost anything in our life. Okay? But that does not mean that God is the one who is doing that thing and he is responsible for it. And I think that we understand that as a general principle, but let me just try to illustrate it. I'm trying to avoid this temptation to say that God causes the pandemic and God sees how bad people get, and so he says, "Okay, I'm going to send you a disease so you're going to learn you'll learn your lesson." It's important to understand that something like this can definitely, yes, absolutely definitely become an occasion for God to use to teach us and to make us aware. I don't believe that pandemics that we see, like the flu and diseases as a whole, those are not rooted in God or in God's will at all. As again, Jesus' ministry proves irrefutably. Every time Jesus confronts illness and disease of any type, he never ascribes it to anyone or anything other than the devil and his angels, to demons, to powers of darkness. These things have no place in God's plan or purpose at all. But that doesn't mean they cannot become occasions for us to learn things and for us to use, for God to use these things to cause us uh, to uh, to learn something. So let me just share with you. I know what I have experienced, and I trust that you have experienced too, without getting into any specific details. I've had more than a few instances in my life, many of them in my early life as a young man, and then my early life as a Christian, where I made choices that were sinful and or foolish or selfish. And as a result of those choices, let's just say for sake of discussion, further down the road, those choices brought with them some very, very painful consequences. Now, if we were to ask, well, who caused those consequences? Did God just like kind of step in and make something happen and create something so that I would learn my lesson about something? No, I don't believe that's what happened. I believe that, as Paul says, what a man sows, he will also reap. So if I sow to things that are not wise, that are foolish or sinful, there's going to be a backlash and a returning somehow in some way as a result of that. But I can tell you very confidently that in those kinds of situations, I have absolutely been convinced that God was seeking to teach me something. Okay? God was seeking to teach me something. I was the one who did the wrong. I was the one who made the choices. I brought calamity into my life. But God was still talking to me. God was still seeking to teach me. It wasn't that God was directly trying to punish me for something I was doing. I was having to live with the results of my choices. But nevertheless, God was in that situation, using that situation to teach me. And I'd like to suggest to you that that's the lesson, the big picture lesson for us to think about here. Something like this COVID-19 pandemic issue and the number of people that have been dying from it can become an occasion for us to seek the things that are above. And I'll get to that last statement. And I want to give a go now with I haven't had my whiteboard with you, so I've worked out a little way that I can do it. So I'm just going to give you a little visual diagram, finally, to make you feel at home with Tom's class. So let's see how this works. Give me just 1 second. Well, come on. There it is. Okay, ta-da! Look at that. We got Tom's drawing. So, here's just a quick way that I'd like to use the visualization. You notice here on the bottom, I've got my classic stick figure guy, right? And I've drawn the arrows pointing down. So this is us in our normal everyday state of living. And the arrows are focusing on what? My family, my job, my relationships, my fears, my desires, what am I going to do about this, my plans, my future. Okay, so it's dealing with the totality of my present, day-to-day, moment-to-moment existence and all that is required of me and all the challenges it brings forth to me, etc., etc. So that's what I'm trying to show. And I am not wanting to suggest to you that that makes you a worldly person. If you're focused on doing your job and you have to work long hours and you can't get a break and you're exasperated with your kids, I'm not saying that that makes you worldly at all. Of course not. But I'm just saying that it is just so easy under the banner of I need to be responsible and I need to secure my future and I need to make sure that nobody takes advantage of me, etc., for us to be so drawn into these things. And so I have God kind of, up at the top there. Whoops, turned it around. Sorry about that. Let me get that back. There we go. God up at the top. So in that way, God is kind of removed. So this is how I tend to want to illustrate it. It's like this. Whoops. Well, my apologies. All right, well, I'm still having to work on this. I'm supposed to have my little tools here to work with, but it's not bringing them up. So anyway, we'll just have to do without that. That's okay. Um, but I was going to draw a bar between God and my stick figure there. And that bar is what eventually happens. God, if you will, gets blocked out, right there, right across here. God is here, I'm here, and we get so consumed with these things here that God is basically blocked out of our lives, and we don't see him and we don't recognize him. It's not that we're atheists and say there is no God, but this pulling us, constantly being pulled down like this, is at the root of our problems. And we think that I have to take care of this, and I got to do this, and I got to do that. And we just don't understand that God has called us to have life in him. There is no life to be found here. There are good things to be found here. There are blessings to be found here. But this is where life is found. We try to find our life here. And many of us who identify ourselves as Christians are finding our lives here. We are. It doesn't mean that we don't believe in God. It doesn't mean that we don't believe the Bible per se, that we never go to church. It doesn't mean any of those things, but it does mean that God is being missed. All right. So, let me go back and let's do one more passage as our time is just about up. So we'll conclude with Colossians 3, beginning in verse 1. Move over here. Sorry about that. All right. So Colossians 3, verse 1, Paul says, "Since then, you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts." Set. Very important term here. It means to fix and to permanently set it there. Okay, so it's one thing if you have a little stick and you hammer it into soft soil, and it can easily be pulled up. It's not set. It's another thing if you have a steel pole and you drop it into concrete and you let it set in the concrete. That pole is now set. That pole is not moving anywhere. So set your heart on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. In other words, set your heart on Christ. Okay? Set your mind on what? Things above. It's the second time we see it here, right here. Set your mind on things above, not on earthly things. The key word here is set. Again, set your minds. Look at that. Right here. Set your hearts. Set your hearts, set your minds. Paul is not saying that there is nothing about earthly things that you should be concerned about. From the standpoint, as I've repeated many times before, obligations to work, obligations to family, all the other responsibilities that we have in daily living that we need to do to survive. Paul is not disdaining any of those things. What he's talking about is what you're set on, what you're focused on. Go back to my drawing, if I could just pick it up, which I'm not going to. Same idea. So I hope that these will give you some things to be thinking about and to be challenged with, and for us to recognize that we're called to live our lives dwelling upon the things that are above. And what I have found by my own spiritual experience and my relationship with the Lord is that the more that by the grace of God I can give myself and permit myself some times throughout the day to not let anything in the world get in my mind, but even if it's just for a few moments, to behold Jesus, to behold him crucified for me, to behold him resurrected for me, to behold Jesus at the right hand of the Father. If I can let those things be clearly seen without any distractions going on at that precise moment, I really think I can say that God gives me what Paul called the peace that passes understanding. And the thing about this peace and the thing about that consolation is it actually is the one thing above everything else that you need to handle all those challenges that you face in your life. It's really weird. If you focus just on the earthly things, you lose not only the things of this earth, but you lose heaven itself. If you focus on heavenly things above everything else, if you focus on the eternal and the unchanging, then you also immediately will have a proper perspective about the things of this world. You won't be irresponsible. You'll love your family. You'll love your children. You'll do what you need to do with the proper disposition of mind and heart because you're set yourself on things that are above. I miss you guys. I hope that we will be together soon. In the meantime, let's pray together. Father, we thank you for the gift of your Son, Jesus, and we're grateful for the opportunities that we have to gain wisdom and to grow. So, Father, may our hearts be in tuned to what we can count on and what we are to call to build our lives upon, and that is in you and in you alone. And may our hearts be ever set upon Jesus, who he is and what he has done for us. And we give our thanks to you in his name. Amen. Thank you again, and we'll see you soon.